I'm very pleased to have you all with us today. My name is Triandafyllidou, and I hold the Climate Excellence Research Chair in Migration and Integration at Toronto Metropolitan University. And before starting this workshop, I would like to make the land acknowledgement. I would like to acknowledge that we meet today in Toronto. That is the traditional land of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississauga tribes. It is the dish with one spoon territory, and the dish means we all have our natural resources that we share in one dish. And there is some controversy about what the one spoon means. Does the one spoon means we have to fight for the spoon, or we all share for the spoon? Like the idea is we are invited from the traditional peoples that lived in this land to share the prosperity in peace and in cooperation. And I think this message also alerts us to the importance of the environment and of climate change and the responsibility we have towards those that came before us and those that are yet to come in keeping this land. And I want to say for those of you, I think a few who are new to TMU changed its name 2 years ago. It was called Ryerson University, and Ryerson was unfortunately the architect of the residential school system that took Indigenous children from their families and not only committed, like in the residential schools, they suffered multiple forms of abuse, but it was also recognized as a cultural genocide for Indigenous peoples, their cultures, and their languages. So, I mean, changing a name is what's in a name. It's not that much, but it was an effort for the university to signal its commitment to truth and reconciliation in Canada. And I say this myself as an uninvited guest in this land, a settler. I came here in 2019, and as a migration scholar, as someone, I was telling Nina yesterday, someone that has been fighting nationalism and ethno-cultural nationalism in particular and borders for 25 years, it is not easy to come to terms with, you know, the claim to the land of Indigenous peoples who have been here for, you know, 10 and 12,000 of years. But I think that's, yeah, that's part of my responsibility as a scholar and as a, you know, as a new Canadian to try and bring these different perspectives together towards a common future in Canada. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce this workshop. I'm delighted to have Nina Glick Schiller here as a Scholar of Excellence at the CERC Migration at TMU, and of course, a set of distinguished panelists here sitting both here and there in an exciting day. I don't have many things to say other than that. I mean, knowing Nina's work, like I reached out and invited her and Stephen Reyna too, and they very kindly accepted the invitation. We had some back and forth about the timing, and here they are. And then in relation to their stay, we had this discussion, you know, what would be a good idea for a workshop. And we found a common interest in this idea of the integration business, in that I had myself, you know, been thinking of how this, you know, migrant infrastructure that many of us have been researching, particularly in the last 10 to 15 years, is turning into a business. And then I had the pleasure of reading some recent work of Nina, and we thought, okay, that's it. And that's how this workshop came to be. So I think I'll pass the baton to Nina to introduce the workshop. And again, I want to thank you all for being here in person, and I want to thank and welcome also our colleagues who are joining us online in the Zoom.
Thank you, Anna. I'd like to, so glad to be here. I'd like to welcome everyone to this workshop and thank Anna and the members of CERC for the opportunity afforded by my CERC appointment. It has allowed me to work with Anna to bring together a set of people I would most like to think with about this emerging question of what is a migration industry and how do we understand it, critique it, and stand back from it to analyze it. And especially, as we know, the people of the world who try to migrate are facing a dire situation, facing war, facing floods, facing climate change, facing political violence, facing continuing imperial projects, facing failing livelihood structures. And in that, when trying to flee and find places not just to move, but to settle and build new futures, they find increasing barriers. And it's a network of barriers, institutions, and actors that has come to be understood as the migration industry, and that we're going to query today. And we're particularly, by looking at the word industry, asking about how are profits made, is there a production of surplus value, is there capital accumulation? So today, what we'd like to do then is to turn our attention both to the actors themselves and the institutions and political powers that be, and also the narrative of migration and development that comes along with it. This morning, we're going to look at the migration industry per se, and in the afternoon, how it's linked to the narratives and outcomes of the migration and development part of the industry. So let me then turn to my presentation that really introduces the concept and explores it and the question of accumulation through some recent research I've done. The term migration industry is increasingly used to acknowledge the nexus of private and public organizations, non-governmental organizations, and government agencies that profit from human mobility. Migration researchers have described the various facets of this migration industry, including its agents, brokers, intermediaries, technical producers that create barriers, private detention centers, governmental and international charities, religious and service organizations, border institutions, service-providing corporations, crime networks, and local humanitarian non-government organizations providing migration services. Wow. So this is this huge nexus of using an approach building on Nina Soros and her colleagues' work. It's a nexus of public and private organizations. But I should note that that what we're interested in today is the fact that this term industry is being used. Is this a metaphor, a nice way of sort of thinking about our material? Or are we actually talking about an industry that as other industries produce profits, actually generate capital? That's the question for us. What do we really imply by this term? As we know, the whole migration research enterprise is filled with metaphors, flows, tides, whatever. And is this just the latest metaphor? Are we talking about something that takes us into discussions of political economy and power? I want to know that profiting from migration is not new. People have been developing businesses in relationship to migration for centuries in activities that range from the Silk Road, camel caravan steamship, labor agents, etc. But here we're focusing on the contemporary moment, the current conjuncture, and transformations of these businesses into a contemporary industry.
May I suggest that we give the floor to Usha to introduce all of you speakers?
Oh,
Before you start the paper,
oh.
yeah, because I realized, yeah.
I didn't realize, of course. That's okay. I'm sorry. No problem.
Anyway, you gave me a good segue into my very short introduction. Long time ago, I was passing by the Canadian High Commission in Lagos. I said, oh, people are going to Canada. Let's look at, go in there and see what is there. So we picked up a piece of paper, which was a paper application, brought it home, did it, sent it off to business, to the office. And about 3 months later, we were called for an interview, and the rest is history. I went to Kerala, India, where I come from, as part of a sort of a acquaintance making for one of our projects in the bigger one between divides, or decision making to come to Canada. And I recognized that there were so many consultants who are there, and nobody would even move without asking a consultant. My own niece, who wants to come to Canada, had already consulted and met with 10 different consultants as to how this should all work. A tiny dot in the map of India, which is Trivandrum, where I come from, has 82 consultants, immigration consultants. So it is an industry for sure. We don't even have to ask a question around is it an industry or not. So here we are talking about industry in the source countries of origin, and then of course the countries here, because the very same people have connections here who will organize things for you. So international students who are coming to study from Kerala, for example, they already have accommodation, everything organized. They're not asking anybody else to concern. So it is that kind of a chain that has developed over time. So I want to introduce also my co-chair, Omar Nguyen, who is research director for one of our major projects. And so both of us will do the chairing if it all requires to be chaired. But I want to introduce just the members who are going to speak now. Of course, Nina is here, Nina Schiller, and then Nina Sorensen is here, and then Pauline Gardner is here, and then Henrik LeBon is here too. Yes, so I'm not going to read all their bios, but
And Neil Klein. Yeah, I think it's
yes, Kalika. Oh, okay. Okay, all right. All of them are here, so I'm not going to read all their long bios, so you can all read it from here. I want to welcome all of you. This is a very interesting workshop in the sense that we never try to understand how the entire trajectory of immigrant happens all the way from their home country till they reach Canada, if at all they reach, and there are so many applications that don't get the approval. And so Anna was just telling me that the title of the workshop itself is so so new and so interesting that about 98 people had actually registered to come in person here. So you can see the amount of interest that people have towards this. So and so I welcome all of you and all of you who are attending this online as well. I hope we have a very interesting workshop with all the presentations and actually a lot to discuss and learn. Thank you. So I give it back to you now.
As you can see, this is unrehearsed. Real life on the ropes. Okay, so I now not only is it unrehearsed, but I can't see the notes I was going to read from, so we'll go on. Okay, so my particular presentation focuses on one part, and we just had some ethnography about that actually. So here's the description, sort of the arrival infrastructures of the humanitarian industrial complex, okay? And these are activities that assist refugees to these are the activities that actually integrate the refugees or migrants into the local structures. And it's particularly, I'm interested in the arrival infrastructures, which focus attention on processing individuals into refugees and migrants or international students, as we observe. So migration scholars have used this word to focus attention on these organizations and actors, and to demonstrate, and the point is that this kind of activity hasn't been examined sufficiently. In fact, the whole concept of migration industry, it needs further development, which is why we're here today. And which is something supposed to happen. So it doesn't. Now it's going. Okay, there we are. So, now there are different, within the debates about what is a migration industry, people have asked, okay, so what's being produced? And there are different approaches. I'm going to just speak about two there, and talk about the critiques and then speak about how I think we can put this together. Now, Cranston and her colleagues focus on the knowledge industry. They look at the administrative labor that produces knowledge, the knowledge of about the migrants, the refugees, and the research too that produces knowledge about the migrants and the refugees. But the problem is, by just saying knowledge industry and administrative labor, this concept doesn't separate out what's public activities, which they may talk about students as customers, but these are, if it's a public institution, it's not actually organized to make a profit. People are in salaries, but it's not making a profit. It's not generating capital, as compared to private institutions who do these activities, which are organized as businesses as part of an industry to generate capital accruing activities. So that approach suffers from putting together of two things that need to be separated. Now, Saltenstein and David Kyle and others have rather focused on the migrants as commodities. They say, okay, it's an industry, migrants are the commodities that are produced, but they focus on laboring bodies in carceral settings and sex industries in unfree contract labor. And where migrant bodies are actually exchanged, and also the labor itself produces value. But the critique is not all migrants labor and not all migrants labor in those kinds of settings. So my response is that we have to broaden our discussion. We have to separate private from public, and we have to look at migrant service workers, the role of migrant service workers in things like arrival structures, where they're actually producing migrants as commodities. And this is what I found in my research, and I want to describe to you what I mean. So there we see in private or public-private settings the generation of capital through the commodification of migrants. And we can not just use the word commodification, but try to pin it down. What does it look like? How does it work? So basically, to speak about migration as an industry and speak about the humanitarian industrial complex, we have to ascertain how new capital is constituted by this industry. So I've said about that. Got the slide. And so I began to think about this when I started looking at the most recent kinds of migrant service delivery in Halle, which is a city in Eastern Germany. Let me just say a few things about the city to tell you where the data comes from. I argue that what I'm describing is not just happening in Halle, it's actually happening all over the world. But there are some path-determined parts of Halle, aspects of Halle, that make it useful, a useful place to examine these processes. And I build on the work that Aisha and I have done, Aisha Schiller where is she? Has done for many years, and that we reported in our book, Migrants and City Making. So what we found is that Halle is a disempowered city after German. It was in former GDR. After unification, it was deindustrialized, depopulated, generally dissed. It was known as a shrinking city, and it lost its reputation for science and industry. It was labeled as a racist city because unemployed youth were attacking people of color in the city, in and around the city. City leaders responded. Not all city leaders respond this way, but these city leaders and many other places responded by saying that Halle was a welcoming city. Mayors that I interviewed and over the years have said the same thing. Migrants are part of the city of Halle. The problem was, while they were trying to reuse this narrative to regenerate the city and attract capital, they didn't manage to do it very much. And so the city ended up in debt and very poor. So they had no money for migrant services. Welcoming narrative, no money. In 2022, at the moment of Ukrainians' arrival in Germany, including in Halle, I set out to see what was happening with the migrant service industry. And we interviewed for 1 to 3 hours and conducted participant observation. We scrutinized official documents and news stories and websites and social media. And we looked for about 8 months. There were 3 student researchers, a coordinator, Julia Wagner, who was a consultant, and whose ideas I build on. And 53, we ended up with 53 interlocutors. We interviewed staff of these organizations, volunteers, and city and state officials. They represented 42 organizations. And at the moment the research began, one of the first interviews I did was with a city administrator of a network called the Halle Network for Democratic Integration. That's a chart. I don't expect you to read it, just to understand that when he handed it to me, my head spun. Because when I started this research, 20 years before, there was only one organization in Halle providing migrant services, and mostly made up of volunteer migrant organizations. There was one umbrella network, one that brought these groups together. And now there were networks of networks. You can describe consortia. But when I tried to sort out what they were doing, I found out that many were doing counseling, which meant just advising migrants on how to go to other organizations rather than providing these actual services such as translation or or housing or any kind of direct assistance, and that or just providing advice. And if there was any services being provided, it was being provided by volunteers in short-term projects. So I began to wonder what this was all about. So it started to make more sense when I analyzed the data and found and identified what I'm calling the 4 logics that transformed the migrant service provision into the local face of the humanitarian industrial complex. Okay, so the first logic is replace public services for migrants with government-funded outsourced services. Okay. The background of this is that the German government, as governments in many places, had reduced direct services by employees. and the services were privatized or, or outsourced to NGOs that were linked to larger corporate, entities. They had, at the same time, they had created multiple barriers to get these services. So in the end, you had to end up at a link to a government agency, but it was very difficult to get linked to a government agency. Then they provided public money. This is the point. They provided public money, but to these other actors. So while it looks like there are NGOs and then there are public-private organizations and charities that assist migrants, what they're mostly doing is assisting migrants to overcome the barriers set up by the government, right? It's with tax money, taxpayer money, okay, which are going into these subcontracted organizations. For example, let's see. So seemingly local projects actually are public-private businesses supported by public funding from taxes or from tax-exempt charitable, religious, or service organizations. Lauren, whose short-term project was considered a counseling center, explained. In the past, there were still counseling at the foreigners registration office. Today, this no longer happens, and everything is now buffered by our counseling center. Ali, a refugee and part-time staff member working for the local branch of an international service organization, noted that his and other projects were needed because the system's too complicated. Migrants can't get appointments, there are not enough workers, and thousands of people. So that was the second logic then, is that these subcontracted organizations make profits by commoditizing migrants. Okay. Staff members face constant pressure to obtain stocks of migrants and create production statistics. Organizations needed inventories of refugees and other migrants to obtain government and charitable funding grants, to secure the salaries of administrators, and to legitimate application of future funding. Pressure led staff members to state that they were in the integration business. This really struck me that, in our interviews, people directly told me, we really wanted to help people. We find ourselves in a business. Migrants then became the stock in trade. In other words, in order to get the grants, in order to renew the grants, in order to pay the few paid staff members' salaries and keep the organization going, they had to provide statistics that these are the people who serve this many per day, per hour, per week. And when you think about it, they became billable items in an asylum or refugee or migrant market. So to maintain the organization, Margaret, the only staff in 2 different projects, faced enormous pressure to produce statistics on each project's productivity and maintain the organization. Obviously, this is not Margaret, but this is how migrants were being treated. She talked about registering. The project uses these big Excel tables and creating all these statistics of events. And so when I'm making these claims, it's coming from data. I don't have time to provide much of it, but I want you to get a sense of how it's sounding. And even with this, after they get the extension, no project could exist more than 3 years. Then they had to start over again and apply for funding. The third logic is provide migrant services using unpaid volunteers or low-wage, precarious workers. Precarious because the jobs only last a short time. So the labor of volunteers and precarious workers with labor dependent on volunteers or precarious workers with minimal benefits. Now, and the volunteers were recruited, especially when migrants are being narrated as a crisis or a shock. That's what migrants fly. That's when volunteers, show up, where can I help? Can I help? Can I help? But what they don't realize, or we tend not to realize, this is an organized policy by the part of the German federal government that when they privatize services, emphasize volunteer efforts. So this, you can read government documents that say this and evaluations that say this, and also that because it's volunteer labor, a relatively minimal amount of grants go to the direct delivery of services. So where do they go? Well, here I've just got some quotes. I don't have much time, so let me just go on. But where people are talking about volunteerism and how they're constantly pressured to replace paid workers to save money. So the fourth logic is channel public funds to local businesses, organizational hierarchies, and corporations. So I'm saying that migrant services are an industry that makes profits in two ways, actually three ways. One, local businesses and public-private corporations and charities face a constant churn. Local businesses make money businesses make money by rents, subcontracted publicity, website services, recruitment contracts, and then every 3 years it starts over again, and there's more subcontracting and more business. The churn is profitable to businesses, but there's more to it than that. Volunteers and precarious workers produce surplus value for the corporate interests at local migrant services. In other words, they're doing the work, and actual capital is accrued by these organizations. How can that be? Well, many of them say they're nonprofit, because if you look at the structure, they're exactly part of a larger network. And there are actually billions of euros in public funds and tax exemptions going to the central offices. And these are corporate and have the right to also run corporate for-profit business. Okay, so they use the legal status as to get tax exemption, and then they also run businesses. So the humanitarian nonprofits accrue corporate capital through wholly owned subsidiaries, and several of the organizations in Holland maintain this Janus-based humanitarian corporate profit making profile. I'm going to just give you one example. So Kristen, a staff member in an international historic charity, it sounded very charitable, but she explained that in the name of the transnational corporation for which she worked, there are many different companies. There are companies that are allowed to make profits, and there are those that are not. So donations and government grants sustain this organization's infrastructure and its public profile. In summary then, the four logics demonstrate how humanitarian services function as profit-producing migration industry. Corporate entities obtain public funding and tax exemptions by commodifying refugees as stock in trade. The labor of service workers and volunteers produce surplus value for privatized or corporate public-private humanitarian organizations. Tax money and charitable donations that channel to corporate structures, and the private businesses of tax-exempt charities, as well as the businesses that support the ever new profile of churn of profit and migrant humanitarian services legitimate corporate profit making. In conclusion, some points for theory development. The theorization of the outsourcing, the privatization of migrant services in the current conjuncture, and some of the papers after the meeting will talk more about that, highlights a form of dispossessive capital accumulation, highlights the loss of democratic control of public services. Democracy is replaced with corporate or authoritarian governance. None of the people who worked, or the people of the city of Holland, had anything to say about where this money was going and how it was being used. And it highlights the fact that dispossessive processes produce dehumanization of both service providers and migrants as clients. Thank you.
Very much, Dina. We in Canada can actually relate to a number of these observations. It's happening right here as well, even though we don't have too much of a private enterprise.
no.
But really that in many cases. And also, thank you so much for sticking to our time. I forgot to mention a couple of housekeeping rules. One is basically everybody has 20 minutes for their presentation. If you could actually stick to that, that would be really nice. I'll show 5 minutes, and then I hope to finish this by 12 so that we have half an hour for question answers. And I would like the question and answers to come at the end of all these presentations. Otherwise, it will eat into the time that we'll have for presentation. Okay, so now I call upon Nina Schiller to
The other Nina?
Yes, yes, yes. Oh, the other now. Sorry. Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Thank you. There is a PowerPoint coming as well. Yeah. Well, while it's being set up, I just want to thank the organizers, Anna and Nina in particular, for the invitation. I'm really thrilled to be here with this crowd of people. I have been looking forward to it for a few months at least, so I expect to learn a lot. I've changed the title of the paper according to what I originally said, because actually I think it is as much about state trafficking as about integration businesses. So just so that you don't think that I'm talking about something else than the original title. Yeah, maybe. No, it's fine. So as I stated in the abstract, I was taken aback by an announcement that the IOM made in 2002, where they asked for funding to assist over 100,000 Ethiopian migrants that were being returned involuntarily from Saudi Arabia. The government of Ethiopia is appealing to donors, the call said, UN agencies and other humanitarian actors for generous support. And mentioning sort of in the passage that more than 750,000 Ethiopians currently reside in Saudi Arabia, that more than half have traveled through irregular means and therefore will need to return home. So it therefore came as a surprise when I less than a year later learned that the Ethiopian government had announced the opportunity of a lifetime for some 500,000 women workers in a bilateral program with Saudi Arabia to go and work as domestic workers. At the outset, promoting legal migration fits well with international migration management efforts that hitherto has prioritized border enforcement over legal migration pathway. But at the same time, I think the announcement could be seen as an attempt to venture into the market for migration facilitation, hitherto outsourced to private actors. And it is therefore, I think, illustrative of a change in the markets for migration control. So in the paper, I substantiate this argument by focusing empirically on the specific migration infrastructure that has historically connected Ethiopian women with the market for domestic employment in the Middle East. For the lack of time, I cannot go into sort of this long history of Ethiopian migration patterns, but I'll be happy to share the paper
But I focus instead in the presentation today on the humanitarian efforts geared towards the reception, rehabilitation, and reintegration of returned migrants to the Global South. But I also take issue with the European hotspot approach that in many ways sort of circumscribes this, finances part of it. And I do that by casting light on the rhetoric and semantic framings used in policy discourse. So partly my paper is about deconstructing what is hot and where is the spot of the hotspot approach. Yeah. So Nina actually already presented the work that Thomas and I did some 10 years ago in our book, where I think what I will just add maybe to what you already said, Nina, is that I think that the markets part is very important for our argument. So it's not just that there is an industry making profits, but also that a lot of actors are forced to sort of sell their services on market terms. So you have to present yourself in a certain way and compete for funding. And we also made this a distinction between the formal and the informal industries, as well as the facilitating and the constraining efforts put into that. So, I mean, it looked like a structuralist framework. It really isn't, but we thought these are the building blocks that we need to take into account. And maybe I should also add, because we really at that time focused on financial capital, money, follow the money. But the more I think about it, I think maybe we should add different forms of capital, humanitarian capital being a very important one that is at stake here. In European policy discourses now, let me see, returning to the paper. Yeah, I lost the thread here. No, I think I don't need to say more about that because you already did, Nina. So let me just briefly introduce why I'm so fascinated by the hotspot approach as also as a semantic exercise here. New frames enable new ways to extract and accumulate capital. Migration hotspots provide an exemplary case for depicting how this may work. The hotspot approach did not appear for the first time in the 2015 European Agenda for Migration Management, but was used already in the 2000s for designing or designating critical border sites, as well as for speaking about crime, natural disasters, etc. Actually, I met the word for the first time in the Dominican Republic around 2000, where I did work among women migrants, some of whom were sex workers. And I learned that anti-trafficking organizations considered the Dominican Republic among the hotspots for sex tourism and sex-related human trafficking. So hot there was thus referring to commercial sex in the tropics. Since then, hotspots have ventured into migration policy debate with the IOM data portal describing hotspots as urban centers, border areas, and transit routes where there is a large presence of people on the move. This, the UNHCR has labeled vulnerability hotspots, and lately hotspots of climate migration is really sort of floating into the migration policy discourse to sort of talk about these large floods of people that we can expect will come. But what is a hotspot? What does it mean? I mean, if we consult common reference sources for definitions, various handbooks of languages or dictionaries, various definitions relating to temperature, unruliness and danger, disease transmission, but also popularity and connectivity catch the eye. So it's, I mean, there's a lot in the word. A hotspot can be a small area with a relatively high temperature in comparison to its surroundings. For example, a place of the upper mantle of the Earth, at which hot magma from the lower mantle of wells, right? It can also be a place of significant activity, danger, violence, where war or other fighting is likely to happen, potentially leading to political, military, or civil unrest, with subsequent internal displacement and refugee movements. However, a hotspot from a migrant perspective denote a popular and exciting place, as the Middle East could be for some Ethiopian women looking for better livelihood prospects. And of course, it also means to most of us a public place where you can connect to wireless internet, that is essential information. So, as part of the Emergency Trust Fund for the Horn of Africa, the EU currently funds various projects in Ethiopia aimed at strengthening local border management, providing information campaigns on the risks involved in irregular migration, assisting the voluntary return of illegal migrants, including rehabilitation and reintegration of those returned, supporting alternative domestic livelihood opportunities, and promoting safe, orderly, and regular migration within the region, within Africa, or Africa and the Middle East. Even if far more money goes into border security, the overall hotspot approach does provide numerous market opportunities for other migration industry actors, be it in humanitarian prevention, rescue initiatives, or ways to offer these local alternatives to migration, create work. Albeit presented as Europe's technical and humanitarian answer to managed migration, the approach remains poorly defined. It claims to be defending European borders by combating human smugglers and traffickers, while simultaneously protecting migrants from deception. The protection capabilities are nevertheless questionable, as they, in the words of Polly Pallister-Wilkins, rather, and I quote, work to inscribe processes of violence that make humanitarian protection necessary in the first instance, not only at home, but also in unfamiliar places, unquote. But care as well as control, I argue in the paper, is not only performed by European and other northern actors. So it's not the global south alone doing things, or the global north alone doing things to the global south, because whether by default or intention, sending states in the global south actively participate in this process, either directly or by outsourcing essential social protection functions to non-state actors. So here you see some Ethiopian women attending an information meeting on this new scheme. Okay, so how does this all work in practice? Sverre Mollen, an anthropologist, has argued that the containment practices of hotspot humanitarian geographies often are framed as double narratives that are intimately bound up with institutionally produced spatial imaginaries among actors seeking to combat human trafficking. Actors who on the one hand may say, well, yeah, we know it's an informal affair very often, but on the other hand, always depict the trafficker as this really bad other. And the deterritorial nature of migrant mobility then challenges the modus operandi of humanitarian programs, as project sites always are demarcated in spatial terms, To operate, programs must both identify exactly what constitutes the target, again, what's hot, and where that target is located, the spot. And because anti-trafficking programs generally are confined to dealing with prevention of departure and rehabilitation upon return, spots become domesticated. And this domestication coincides with two objectives, that of curbing international migration and that of boosting local projects and humanitarian interventions. And hereby, the demand side of trafficking becomes disguised, as does, I will argue, state interest in operating bilateral migration schemes. International organizations, including human rights and anti-trafficking entities, all predict that the combined effects of current economic hardship, protracted conflict situations, and environmental hazards create a profitable environment for traffickers that will increase, say, Ethiopian women and children's vulnerability to exploitation. So what's hot is really well defined here. Mapping the spots before crisis strikes then become part of crisis preparedness plans. In this regard, several locations in Ethiopia have been singled out, and there are various narratives about why these are particular regions to be dealt with. Already in 2005, the international NGO Freedom Fund launched a hotspot in partnership with the Ethiopian government with the aim of reducing the vulnerability of potential migrants and return trafficking victims from the Middle East. And today, numerous other NGOs offer similar services in other hotspots located across the country, very much in the way that Nina already explained. So under domestic pressure to protect national migrant workers and international pressure to halt irregular migration, Ethiopia has several times posed a partial ban on women traveling to Lebanon, for instance, in 2008, and a 5-year ban on women traveling to Saudi Arabia for domestic work. So, I mean, until very recently, there was a ban because our citizens are badly treated there. So the new scheme to export 500,000 women and offering the opportunity of a lifetime or the possibilities for a brighter future, as some of these ads, state ads, would have it, does in a way sound great, right? Because then this is regular migration. It's no longer irregular migration, it's state sanctioned. But already in the inception phase, investigative journalism has demonstrated how state institutions at central and regional level have used social media to recruit young women at college and universities. I mean, young women who are studying, often spreading misleading promises of working conditions and salary levels. Direct recruitment through phone calls to former deported workers has also taken place, as has, at least in some districts, requirements paying recruitment and registration fees, which is illegal. So apart from serving as an official channel of migration, ulterior motives are quite obvious. I mean, to stimulate a war-torn Ethiopian economy. These new agreements require salaries to be paid in Ethiopian birr exclusively, and that these money are remitted, sent to Ethiopia through local banks, Ethiopian banks, right? Yeah, let me see. The U.S. Department of State's Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons has for many years identified Ethiopia as a country with a burgeoning human trafficking problem in the form of adult and child labor, as well as organ harvesting. The government of Ethiopia does not fully meet the minimum standards for eliminating human trafficking, but has lately made progress, resulting in an upgrade from the Tier 2 watch list to Tier 2 in the 2023 TIP report, which is interesting that this happens at that moment. As accurate data on the extent of trafficking in human beings are hard to find, human trafficking is believed to be underreported, underdetected, and underprosecuted. In the Ethiopian case, however, I would say that overreporting might constitute a different, albeit related problem, because empirical studies have almost entirely been done by anti-trafficking NGOs who meet only those who come to seek their assistance. And they have sort of also reinforced this idea that women who travel on their own will most likely fall prey to traffickers whatsoever. Additional risk factors attributed to the Ethiopian state have historically included corruption, instances of violence and abuse committed by border police, weakly enforced laws, inconsistent prosecution, etc. But what about the procurement of workers, which is central here? What if the state is employing the same tactics long used by private actors, such as promising good pay, job security, and downplaying the risk? Is the state then not implicated in the exploitation? Or can we actually say, has the state become the trafficker? So that I conclude with the words of several human rights women activists, former domestic workers or current domestic workers, who say that it is concerning that the government is employing the same tactics long used by private agents, adding that the use of social media implies that the government is targeting youth. It is their way of reaching out to young people and taking advantage of their eagerness to find jobs and opportunities elsewhere, unquote. EU migration policy initiative towards Africa are geared towards regionally containing migration. First and foremost, by enhancing the capacity of regional states to manage migration. In this process, entrenched political problems are rendered and transformed into technical and bureaucratic practices by policy discourse and certain keywords, such as hotspots. Such practices make selective use of data and facts to arrive at specific policy prescriptions. For instance, that enhanced migration management will stop illegal migration, which again is caused by human smugglers and traffickers. As argued by John Campbell, this kind of argumentation is based on a gross simplification of a complex set of social, political, and economic processes. It also entails a badly hidden purpose, namely that policy success is contingent on the willingness and ability of African states to support EU objectives. In an ironic twist then, the EU hotspot approach in fact legitimizes the new Ethiopian scheme to export women for domestic work in Saudi Arabia. The EU, how can we criticize something that fits the approach? Because this is, after all, both regular and regional South-South migration. To the extent that recruitment practices involve misleading recruits about working conditions and demanding fees, I really think one could say that the Ethiopian state is doing the trafficking now. What is clear also is that this new state practice fundamentally is restructuring the markets for migration control in Ethiopia. So we actually see that markets are not stable, but change over time. If I have 1 minute, I would just say that this is sort of a very critical semantic reading that do not really take the experiences of Ethiopian women into account. I have been working there now for 4 years with domestic workers who are actually, many of them, quite strong women. So focusing solely on humanitarian concerns and abusive practices easily overlook the broader issues of global gender and class relations as well as labor rights. I think this EU approach and other humanitarian approaches that generally portray women domestic workers as victims in need of rescue is isolating their experience and how domestic forms of violence is what they also flee from. It's not that coming back to Ethiopia will give them better working conditions or less exploitation necessarily. Actually, going to the Middle East can for some women be their way out. So I think I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nina. Thank you for highlighting the contradictory roles played by the state. I'd also like to add that sometimes hotspots are not only the sending states, it can also be the transit states. For example, a whole lot of people come from all over Africa to Libya. From Libya to Europe is not too much of a stretch for migration industry. But at the same time, EU funds Libya to stop that migration. And therefore, the transit country has become a hotspot itself. So it's an extremely interesting notion around hotspots and all of that. So I will now go on to call on Ais Kaiker.
You want
Kaiker, University. Okay, Ais Kaiker, University of Vienna on political economy of containment industries, confinement and immobilized labor in the making phase.
Change or
Yeah. Exactly.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be part of this group. It is amazing. And actually, I think that all the speakers have laid the ground for my paper, and especially looking at the kind of the involvement and the location of the state that I have come. In this paper, I zoom in on the striking historical geography of a street in Linz, the third largest city of Austria, through the lens of extractivism, forms of confined labor, and raise some questions about the link between varieties of labor, forms of confinement, and accumulation in relation to extractivism. Such a focus, I think, opens up the continuities and discontinuities in the networks, institutions, and organizations that govern the displaced and their care, as well as the forms of extraction in their containment. In what follows, I argue that we need to rethink what we refer to by the business of migration industry in relation to the broader dynamics of accumulation. And to do this, we need to shift our analytical lens to differing forms of extractivism. I claim that such an analytical shift enables us to situate the migration industry in relation to the changing forms of governance within broader dynamics of current restructuring of capital and state power in the changing global dynamics. I attempt to show these changing dynamics first in relation to the long durée of extraction through confinement, including the various forms of extraction in migrant and refugee care in Linz. Then I drove attention to the importance of connecting migration governance as business to changing forms of capital accumulation and extraction. There is not a one single homogenic capital accumulation. Finally, I focus on the convoluted architecture of migration industries, which many of you have indicated as being paradigmatic of the changing forms of governance in the context of rising neoliberal authoritarianism. On March 4th last year, there was an arson attack in Linz that burned down parts of the future shelter for the asylum seekers. The shelter was on Lunza Street in Linz. Before rolling back to the historical geography of this place, I should note that Lunza Street is situated in the area of the production site of the Austria's major steel company, voestalpine. This is the flagship company of Austria's post-war industry, and most importantly, the successor of the subsidiary of the infamous industrial conglomerate of Nazi Germany, Hermann Göring's steelworks. In 1941, Linz concentration camp 3 was established on Lunza Street, next to the Göring steelwork production site. This camp was part of the ill-famed concentration camp Mauthausen in Linz. Needless to say, this concentration camp was also a forced labor camp. The Lunza Street camp had 7,000 prisoners who were coerced to work in the booming steel and arms industry during the Second World War. Last year's arson asylum seekers shelter was just 15 minutes walk distance to the concentration camp on the same street. After the end of the war in 1945 until 1959, like many other concentration camps at the time, the barracks on Lunza Street accommodated the liberated camp prisoners as well as the displaced persons from different parts of the Reich. The inhabitants were all subject to differentiated labor and mobility regulations. The DP camp on Lunza Street in Linz was demolished only in 1972 to be replaced by 5 apartment blocks that you see, which were then used to accommodate guest workers as well as commuting temporary labor recruited for the booming voestalpine steel industry. These new buildings were then owned by a property management company of the city of Linz, GWG, where the steel company, voestalpine, and Siemens also had shares. The guest workers and commuter temporary workers accommodated in this facility were very much subject to several spatial, temporal mobility restrictions due to their legal and contractual status. Though this was not coerced or bonded labor in the classical sense, it was a confined labor in any case. With the relative deindustrialization of Linz, together with the downsizing of the steel industry, its guest workers' labor was also downsized. At the beginning of the 1990s, these workers' blocks on Lunza Street, which were by then held empty, were transformed, this time into facilities for a reception center for refugees fleeing the Yugoslav wars. We are still on the same plot of land. The reception center later became a shelter for refugees and asylum seekers in the 1990s, who were left in limbo in waiting. The facility was managed again by a large non-profit NGO, Volkshilfe, but was owned by a real estate firm, this time GWL, responsible for the maintenance of the buildings. In 2004, the contract for the buildings ran out, the reception center was closed, and the emptied apartment blocks on Lunza Street were finally demolished in 2014. I think the Lunza Street is a good entry point for exploring the entangled processes of extraction, displacement, forced and immobile labor regimes, as well as the centrality of racial hierarchies to expropriation and accumulation and the remaking of the industrial and the post-industrial city of Linz. I do not get into the racial capitalism part in this paper. It urges us, I think, to focus on the political economy of confinement and immobilized labor, as well as the capitalization of containment and its management in studying the making of the city's wealth and sociability. In recent years, critiques from feminist theorists and students of colonial extractivism argued for the need to unmoor extractivism from certain types of activities tied to land and natural resources, and from the centrality of wage or unwaged labor, consequently from the exploitation-based accumulation. They rightly called for the expansion of this concept as a modality of capital accumulation to new spaces and to non-material resources such as tourism, cultural industries, finance, logistics, and digital economies, as well as to refugee and migration industries, I would add. The laborers of the concentration and the DP camps, of the collective housing of the guest worker blocks, and the asylum seekers of the reception center and of the refugee shelters are often defined, assessed, and inscribed into distinct categories, curtailing their relations to common structural forces and processes, both in scholarship and politics. They are separate. Expanding the concept of extractivism to signify deeper underlying logics of expropriation, subjectification, and accumulation is useful, I think, to go beyond this kind of compartmentalized, disconnected historiography of links and the related regimes of labor, value, and governance that shape the economic, political, and the affective fabric of it. The concept of expanded extractivism enables, I think, us to bring the forced labor of concentration camps, the DPs, the regulated immobility of mobility and immobility of guest workers regime, and the unwaged labor of the asylum seekers, refugees of the shelters, and their management industry into a common lens, not as anomalies to be bracketed out, but as substantial part of the process of accumulation in this decade. When placed together, despite the differences among the camp inhabitants, the guest workers, the temporary seasonal workers, and those in the refugee asylum seeker shelters, they were all subject to collective housing with heightened control on the residents' labor, time, and social relations, which I think established the grounds for the capitalization of their confinement, but also inflicted injuries on the social and political relations and connections among the inhabitants. I will not go into those injuries then. Approaching the process of migration and the management of governance as economies, in fact as industry, where the boundaries have been between public and private and legal and illegal were blurred, I think brought, and many of the people who contributed to that are sitting with us, brought a very fresh air into migration scholarship. The question of privatization, economic rationalities, and who profits from migration management loom large in the studies of migration industries. We have heard that too. It is true that scholars of the migration industry underline the political embeddedness of these processes, and some rightly argue for the necessity of connecting these to capital accumulation, especially into city making. However, in order to capture the connection between the economics of migration management and governance and the processes of capital accumulation, we need an analytical vocabulary beyond the general proposition of accumulation by dispossession. Extraction and expropriation are fundamental to accumulation processes, but extraction is not simply a model of accumulation by dispossession. Governance of confinement and mobility provide a fertile ground for accumulation through extraction and expropriation, for which deployment of forceful displacement, violence, and dispossession are central. I suggest that in order to capture and narrate the processes of migration control management and governance in connection to multiple forms of accumulation embedded in a historical conjuncture, we need to focus on varying forms of extraction and the related value regimes beyond the single logic of capital and beyond the single logic of economic capital. It is important to focus on how displaced lives are made to attain value to be extracted within the multiscalar architecture of state and non-state actors. The concept of value regimes is useful to think about the complex architecture of extraction beyond the single economic logic. There is no doubt that migration economies are closely intertwined with privatized processes and private capital. However, in our contemporary world, the logic of privatization and the alignment of private and public capital are far from being straightforward, but in the process of reorganization in close relation to the changing nature of political authority. In this sense, we need to decenter the privatization emphasis of the migration industry approaches in relation to the reorganization of state power. Political authority in urban governance is being reconfigured anew in our contemporary historical conjuncture, marked by the recentralization and rescaling of state power in a complex way. Thus, like every analysis of political economy, the analysis of the political economy of migration industry and governance needs to be strongly embedded in this historical conjuncture. And I think the political economy of migration industries and care provide a suitable entry to explore these changing forms of state power and to capture the changing dynamics of neoliberal urbanism through increasing executive centralization. I think this is not, we could not operate with the neoliberal urbanism for the what we had for 20 years ago now. The apparatus of refugee governance increasingly operates new ways of commodifying, outsourcing, financializing migrant lives, deportation, deportable detention, waiting time surveillance. The Refugee Reception Center and the Asylum Seeker Shelter in Lunza Street in the 1990s is an interesting case of a rather early financialization of refugee care and management. The aforementioned real estate firm, GBL, which owned the facility of the Refugee Processing Center on Lunza Street, was charging each bed with approximately 300 euros per month. In today's value, already in the beginning of the 1990s. We know that the outsourcing of services by provincial and city governments to bodies composed of NGOs, private companies, had a rather convoluted architecture, and cities in Austria are no exception. Today, it is common knowledge that they subcontract to well-established holdings like conglomerates, like Diakonie, Caritas, Volkshilfe, Samaritergruppe, Bund, to provide food, accommodation, registration, and counseling. Interestingly, all these have been in play on Lunza Street since 1970s. We also know that these non-profit charity institutions are strongly enmeshed with private capital, which we heard from Nina too. In Austria case, however, what is interesting is the Ministry of Interior of Austria was responsible for basic care during the admissibility procedure of those seeking protection, is now in the picture of the capitalization of provision of care in a peculiar way. It has established its own subcontracting company, BBU GmbH, within the ministry, and has been outsourcing care to its own company under the direct control of the ministers since 2020, with an explicit mission of fighting against the private capital and migration industry. They sound very much like us. Let me give a little background to this. In 2003, care for asylum seekers in Austria, how many minutes? One, maybe two. Okay, BBU, and established in 2020, it took the tasks of the private companies and transferred to everything to itself, and it was established in the coalition government of the conservatives and the far right. It could be BBU, could be designated as an all-inclusive care complex for asylum seekers, refugees, and the displaced, as it is designated to provide not only care, but legal counseling, including return counseling, as well as interpreters, but also human rights observers for deportation. It is 100% owned and financed by the federal state, and the explicit aim of its foundation was to reduce cost, ensure quality, but above all, to take over the tasks that have been fulfilled by NGOs and private corporate capital and decrease state dependency on these actors. I think it represents a paradigmatic development. No doubt the extractive aspect of BBU is important. However, what is crucial here is the way the Ministry of Interior gains a variety of rights within that. He appoints the head of the BBU, half of the board of directors, appoints the head of the legal counseling department and the legal advisors and the human rights observers. Now the federal state can transfer infrastructure, buildings into the hands of BBU. So it is paradigmatic of the centralization of the decision-making process and resource allocation vis-a-vis the care of the displaced beyond the purview of bodies of government. So I think it marks the increasing power of the central political authority overriding the municipal and local decision-making processes, often through emergency rule and legislation, exceptional legislation. So I think it is important the dazzling light of compartmentalized historiography of cities, labor and displacement hinders us from seeing the common grounds and contour lines connecting not only disparate places, but also periods, processes, institutions, and groups of actors in the making and remaking of cities. So I think this shifting the lens helps us to see discontinuities, but also the continuities. Last but not least, it is also crucial to explore the different ways migrants, refugees are emplaced within structures and forms of governance and care in relation to the context, changing context of regimes of value at a given historical conjuncture. When the conjuncture is changing, together with the capital restructuring and rescaling of statehood, we could not continue our analysis and critique of migration industries without taking note of the reconfiguration of neoliberal global order. Unpacking this complex landscape of recentralization within neoliberal authoritarianism, despite the guise of decentralized structures, is politically important, I think, to approach migration industries embedded within the restructuring of capital, forms of accumulation, but also changing forms of state power. Thank you. Sorry for the
Thank you. Interesting, from a very historical and even contemporary point of view, the exploitation-based capital accumulation is extremely relevant to all of us, particularly in countries like many countries in the Middle East, which depend quite a lot on imported labor and how the exploitation-based capital accumulation happens in all of those states. And we pointed out to that process, if somebody is asking them about the process, usually the answer is the migrants are making money, they're sending it to their home countries, development is happening there. So nothing much to be told about that. But anyway, so we go next to Pauline Gardner. Thank you very much for being here, the political economy of migration. I have, all right. So I'm for something a little bit different. Again, thank you so much for including this. Is amazing. I'm still trying to process new ideas from my panelists. But anyway, I'll get right into this, and the slides can happen or not because they're self-explanatory. Filipino Canadian proud with a strong sense of belonging read the header of a 2023 StatsCan Plus publication. Filipino Canadians are hardworking, stated as subheading. The report presents an intriguing contradiction that might superficially read as a immigration success story and likely will be packaged as such in political discourse in one or both contexts. Here I propose an alternative reading situated in the historical conditionalities of Philippine political economy and the dialectics of migration politics in the post-Marcos era, 1986 to now. And I have three ideas just to keep in the back of your mind. The journalist-like quality of many migrants' lives, and again, this is, I think we even talked about this, lives as exploited global workers, a typical story in much of the literature, who were encouraged within the Philippines to consider themselves as national heroes for their sacrificial contributions. And indeed, many workers I have met over the years understand and work through these contradictions. And then two, the interpolation of what we might still call, in an old-fashioned way, structure and agency in the possibilities and potentials of international migration, always mediated by domestic migration and immigration politics in at least two states. Is there something I'm doing wrong or? Oh, okay, I just. And three, the iterations of capitalism and value generation in multiple senses as surplus value and as the accommodations and sense-making that people afford their labor and lives, in effect, their social relations and their commitments to home and way of life, or what can be grasped but not explained as culture a la Bourdieu. This set of ideas needs to be connected to the temporalities, both the state policies and to the migration planning sequence of migrants' lives, which I elaborate here as the social reproduction of Philippine migration, a theme taken up in a current research project with Catherine Bryan and collaborating colleagues in the Philippines, Mala Assis and Clarence Batan. Some of you may know them. According to StatsCan, there are nearly 1 million Canadians with Filipino roots, over 1/3 of whom arrived within the previous decade, and that is key here. Their unemployment rate is 1% below the national average. After taxes, their take-home wages average on the 2020 Canadian median, and perhaps less surprising, given what our research reveals about decisions underlying migration journeys, but I have to smile when I say this, 9 out of 10 Filipino Canadians reported a somewhat strong or very strong sense of belonging to Canada, compared with 84% of other Canadians. To clarify this contradiction, 36.6% arrived on temporary and related family reunification visas, and extrapolating from this, Philippine migration to Canada is possible through upwards of 200 visa streams, including a complex array of temporary programs promoted in Philippine recruitment and educational institutions as potential pathways to permanency. And in particular instances, they have been. But critical in this migration pathway through temporary work visas is that the vast majority of visa holders are university graduates working in temporary jobs. This was true for the Popular Living Caregiver Program, which was terminated in 2019, and for the large influx of Filipino temporary workers in food services and other in-demand labor slots. All such jobs are subject to skill designations under, I know many of you know this, but perhaps not everybody, our National Occupational Classification System, NOC. I want to deviate from this. Okay. Ethnographic research with Catherine Bryan, my research partner, over the last 10 years focused on temporary visa holders awaiting deployment. I'm up to slide 5 already, never mind.
You want me to do that?
Sure.
Just give me a note.
Okay. Awaiting deployment in Canada's fast food sector. Workers we interviewed in Manila held university degrees,
and had relevant management job experience, but had accepted employment as counter attendants in anticipation of a possible promotion to a supervisory position, which would buff them up the NOC code to make them eligible to become permanent but certain things happened. Everyone we spoke to spoke about their faith in this, God willing, this will happen to me. On our twice annual field trips, we observed that the contingencies attached to shifting up a NOC code at an employer's whim were glossed over by recruitment agencies, and agency officials downplayed the risks of temporary work while upselling the possibilities of permanency. Their recruitment strategy was to target university graduates for a suite of these available positions, typically unskilled. Note here the possibilities for employer exploitation in Canada, as workers competed for employer approval and therefore promotion, and then a possible pathway to permanency. Catherine's work earlier in Manitoba had shown that actually this was entirely possible, but not everybody made it. And then we met people who came back and applied again anywhere, maybe to the Middle East, a much less desirable location. To sum up this section, our research together and individually over the last 15 years indicates a pattern of university-educated applicants whose migration preparations are funded by remittances from previous generations of globally spread relatives, many of whom left the Philippines as contract workers overseas. Our work presents this pattern as the social reproduction of migration, given that after parental economic security, education of kin, siblings, your own kids, nieces and nephews is prioritized. Typically, remittance recipients then set their sights on an education that will facilitate their own migration pathway to a desirable location. Despite evidence of a growing middle class in the Philippines, there's no comparison with if you get a permanent example of migration to Canada, whether it's in healthcare, finance, whatever. So the first step is education. Family resources are pooled, completing high school and some tertiary level training to facilitate internal migration within the Philippines, which can then possibly allow for a further movement. Because Filipinos are globally dispersed, there is a high degree of knowledge about different labor markets, and so on. I think I just said that, sorry. The recruitment sector in the Philippines is similarly preoccupied with promoting possible pathways, and the Philippine state is also monitoring policies as it seeks to regulate its own actors within its own migration apparatus. Yet it receives visiting delegations of state actors who are looking to receive their migrant workers, increasingly high skilled, in different places. I could go on and on about that, ask me later. To return to the 21 census, over 1/3 of the nearly 1 million who reported being born in the Philippines arrived in the last decade. This combines with what the Philippine Star recently described, and we can go on till we get to this migration boom thing, as a migration boom. And I don't know if you know this, there's been an incredible, phenomenal increase, shocking, in Filipino international students, which was only recently noted as a possible pathway explicitly to permanency. So we went from 5,000 in 2019 up to 49,000 last year, making it the third largest foreign student population. And I saw in the Canadian Embassy when I was there last November, they've added extra floors to the embassy setup just to process these applications. Okay, Philippines labor export is big business. And every year I look at this, the dollars, the billions remitted go up. The reported number of people leaving the country from April to December 22, 1.96 million. Of these, more than half, close to 60% were females, which continues a pattern of the feminization of Philippine migration first evident when I started doing my work in the mid-1980s. And again, close to 70% of these women are engaged in what they now call elementary occupations, which I won't define for you now. Male jobs, more diverse, and 80% of those overseas contract workers landed in Asia, including the Middle East. The big business, 37.2 billion, up by 3%, was recorded in 2023. Incredible, eh? And then this is 8.5% of the GDP and 7.7% of the gross national income. I just want to emphasize here that these remittances are transferred from wages earned by labor that has already had profit extracted as surplus value in the sense clarified by Marx. Migrant workers abroad in most labor markets earn meager wages, living and working under conditions not tolerated by locals, and yet they remit these billions, all of which is plowed back into Philippine local economies. And I want to emphasize educational institutions preparing the next generation of well-qualified, well-disciplined migrants. And it's a transnational stretching of all of this. Again, I cite Nina, but I won't go into that. So I'm going to jump ahead because I'm getting worried that I'm running out of time. This is now going to start, I'll start to look at what they do in the Philippines. Philippine labor export in the 1990s was contentious domestically. But it was in the 1980s. That's when I started working. In the 1980s, when labor export became official policy and the Philippine state sought to discipline overseas contract workers through pre-departure orientation seminars. And this was implemented in 1983. They became prerequisite to the mandatory exit visas for labor migrants departing the country, right? So you had to have a visa and a contract and to an approved labor market. Of course, not everybody does that. Many don't, but this is the part of it. In the earliest iteration, the seminars mostly focused upon practical concerns related to workers adjusting to their foreign destinations, plus the must-dos and don'ts regarding the responsibilities of the Philippine state. And at this time, there were also escalating migration politics with reports of violence and abuse towards women working overseas. This is inside Philippine migration politics, and Fidel Ramos barely became elected because the tensions were high. He had to quickly adjust and create new, better policies for migrants. So the seminars were recast, and in 2007, new longer programming finally made it into place. And this extended PDOS also took better account of women migrant workers. It included useful sections on self-care, the realities of domestic work, where to seek help, their rights, the OFWs, information about government programming for them and their families left behind. There was a whole new suite of policies for left behind families, and financial literacy, and then reintegration programs. So there's a focus on interest in financial literacy. While initially viewed as a good practice, one migration expert recently told me implementation has been very uneven, and sadly over the years it has become so watered down from its original intent. Perhaps the very idea of the pre-departure orientation seminar needs serious rethinking. Personnel delivering sessions have varying degrees of experience, and on point for this workshop, there are financial incentives for NGOs and recruitment agencies to deliver these, they're called PDOS, a further feature of the profitability associated with labor export. Apparently various assessments have been completed, but recommended changes and improvements have been stored. And the content of the longer form of PDOS, when delivered as intended, has some useful information, especially for first-time migrants. However, it exemplifies the disciplining of migrant workers who are encouraged to see themselves as responsible workers and representatives of the nation state. Anna Guevara did some nice work on this in 2006. In an article, she talks about how these official Filipina empowerment seminars to address their vulnerabilities emphasize behaviors for good wives and mothers, and is shaped by a gendered moral economy whereby family, religion, and nationalism become entangled with neoliberal ideas about economic productivity. Further, as Pico has argued, the disciplining aspect of migration management implies control, and control implies the disciplining of migrants as a two-way process. Disciplining mobility is both of disciplining people and self-disciplining. That is achieving disciplining by the people themselves. And the national celebration of migrant heroes that Ramos implemented serves the same purpose. So flipping back to Canada now, I'm up to slide 15, so we can just go through it. The transnational stretching, the business of pre-arrivals. Pre-arrival seminars known as the Canadian Immigrant Integration Program are offered to visa-ready workers in several main immigrant sending countries, including the Philippines. Launched in 2007 as a pilot program and confirmed as a full-fledged service described on the Government of Canada website as a groundbreaking initiative, the seminars offer free pre-departure orientation seminars to federal skilled workers and provincial nominees and their spouses and adult dependents to better prepare for economic success by providing information, planning, and online support through Canadian partners. Important here is that seminars are outsourced to the Association of Canadian Community Colleges and a network of partners, integration actors, all dependent on government funding across Canada. Again, we see the disciplining of Canada's ideal immigrants to prod them to become more economically successful, or within a transnational framework where revenue is generated by entrepreneurial service providers funded by the Canadian state. In the early stages of CIIP's presence in Manila, Catherine and I met with staff and observed the delivery of several seminars. And later in 2016, we observed pre-departure seminars that were offered by the Manila office of the IOM. There was really no comparison, but it was a new common curriculum by the time we saw the IOM one. And again, we saw some good things happening, but the disciplining aspect was still present. And we acknowledged at the time that the migrants were being seen as units of labor and value to capital. This whole pre-departure training is about getting them into the Canadian economy to fill those slots that people need. So in conclusion, there are parallel arguments to be made about transnational integration business. I have tried to set the pre-departure and pre-arrival briefings for the Philippines-Canada migration corridor into the context of the social reproduction of Philippine migration and labor export. There is no doubt that capital accumulation is paramount from the beginning to the end of the process, nor is there any doubt about the economic benefits to both countries from migrant contributions and, I would say, personal sacrifices. However, this is key, and I think, Nina, you alluded to this. Given that migration ambition has become normalized as part of the political and economic and cultural landscape in the Philippines, and given that migrants will attempt to leave with or without official documents, Philippine migration management serves a purpose. Indeed, as IOM officials in Manila told us, the Philippines is considered a model as a labor export country. Which brings us back to the contradictory profile of recently arrived Filipinos in Canada. As disciplined, hardworking migrants, they may well express loyalty to Canada, but at what personal cost, given the extraordinary efforts over successive generations and the hardships of the migrants and those who have helped them? What are the costs of this? It would be useful to know more about the scope of Canada's integration services in terms of today. I didn't get the opportunity to look into that. Some of you may have. And what I'm particularly interested in is how many temporary turned permanent migrants continue in the precarious jobs that they arrived in, or jobs below their skill levels, which I've written about quite a lot. How are international students faring in Canada's housing crisis with the exorbitant rentals that we all know about? And what will happen to these potential migrants to those potential migrants who missed the application deadline. People who are preparing, who missed the deadline for international student visas before the recently announced policy changes. And these questions are urgent and must be set within the context where many thousands will have to yet again adapt to the vagaries of Canada's immigration, political economy, and they will. These experience tells me they will.
Thank you, Pauline. Yes. Labor export is big business in the Philippines, and if you could think about the immigration business or export business, recruitment sector in the Philippines, it is probably one of the countries that started this whole business.
Yeah.
I once listened to a scholar from Philippines who was talking about migration, immigration from Philippines, who said these recruitment agents sometimes advise medical doctors to go and do nursing.
Yeah,
So that when they come to Canada,
Absolutely, I've met
they
them.
get better opportunities, and medicine is not going to fly in Canada. All right, thank you so much.
Still doing it, by the way.
Oh,
as we speak.
Okay, now we go to our final presenter, Henrik Lebrun and then Nick Cohen, and they are going to tell us about migration industry and city making.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you everyone for coming and for sticking that long. First, big thank you to the co-conveners, Anna, Ina, and we really have to say that we're very humbled to be here and present our work and be in the presence of people whose work really inspired us, not only in the context of this particular paper, but just in general. So thank you, everyone, and thank you, Jessica, who made our trip and our stay
Thank you.
possible. Thank you for that. The paper that we are going to be presenting today is basically co-authored by Henrik, myself, and our colleague Tatiana Fogelman from Roskilde University. She wasn't able to join us, unfortunately, but she's very much with us in spirit. And the three of us have been working in sort of on different projects over the last 10 or 12 years. So the presentation today essentially builds primarily on two projects, although we do have others that are kind of rolling. The primary one is a special issue that was published a couple of years ago in the journal Urban Studies, 2022, kind of the peak slightly after the peak of the pandemic. And we had our own editorial plus 12 contributors from, as you can see, from around the world, Europe, Asia, North America, and South Africa. So you're more than welcome to peek at the issue whenever you have a minute. The other more recent project that we're collaborating on is called, it was funded a couple of years ago by the Volkswagen Foundation, Urban Citizenship Making at Times of Crisis. And there we had case studies from the three cities that we're residing in, so Berlin, Copenhagen, and Tel Aviv. And in that particular project, we were assisted and we worked with three fantastic research students, master's, doctoral, and postdoctoral students. So Lisa, Daniela, and Maya. So basically, in terms of the content of the presentation, the migration industries, or MI as a concept, which I think pretty much all of us have already are kind of familiar with, and it's been talked about quite extensively over the last hour and a half. Then we want to talk about MI and the urban, okay? Specifically offer, and this is again building on the editorial, providing what we see as three kind of entry points, perspectives, vantage points onto this sort of nexus between cities and the MI, and then talk about obviously the mutually constitutive kind of relations. So cities, that's the argument, cities make MIs, and MIs to a certain degree make cities as well, and then offer some remarks by ways of conclusion. So again, this has been said already, and anybody who's even slightly familiar with the MI literature knows that it started out sort of historically by highlighting the role of commercial intermediaries, brokers, the work of Harney, later on Salt and Stein in the mid to late 90s. More recently, 2009, migration merchants, Kyle and Liang. And the focus has been primarily on profit generation through the mediating role of individuals who are, or organizations in the migration business or industry. More recently, in contributions by Hernandez-Leon, attention to modes of integration control, as well as on NGOs and other governmental actors were sort of conceptualized as the rescue or aid industry. This is his contributions both in 2008 and I believe in 2013, which was part of the fantastic book by Nina and Thomas. And Cranston and et al. In 2019 in Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies, as has been said before, very much focused on the work, right, on the labor rather than the profit, arguing that it's the labor involved in managing, facilitating, and controlling migration that makes it an industry. Okay, so there's sort of different kind of sort of perspectives or articulations of the MI. The urban, sort of, in general, and more specifically, place and space has been strangely absent from the discussion. Now, as some of the other presenters were talking, I noted down, obviously names of cities came up, right? We had Halle, we had Beirut, we had Linz, right, and so on and so forth. Linz, sorry. But we kind of felt, and I think that came up in the conversations we had back in 2019, 2020, that the urban as a concept, rather than specific cities, was something that was a bit not there, essentially. At the same time, urban scholars, and Henrik is an urban sociologist, I'm a social urban geographer. It was very much not, it kind of went under the radar of most urban scholars. So basically what we were trying to do in the context of this paper, this two project to some extent, is to bring the MI and the urban closer together, bring them into a dialogue, sort of think of cities as the places where labor, techno-physical infrastructure and profits of the MI are located, generated, or sort of flown through, right? The cities are not always just a place where, it gets located or situated, but cities are also these sort of nodes, right, within sort of broader networks. So that was one thing, and then the other objective was to think about the role of the industry in shaping cities and specific urban sections. So in some of the cases that that featured in the special issue, it wasn't the entire city. It might have been specific neighborhoods or even singular streets or several blocks within one street. So we felt this whole kind of specific urban geography had to be accounted for. Next, I think that's you.
Yeah, and yeah, you mentioned already that in 2018-19 we started this conversation among the three of us, how to maybe bring this closer together, an urban lens and the MI concept. And what we then did was we basically asked a number of colleagues who work in urban studies and are interested in migration, and said to them, hey, why don't you look at your empirical material, but try to look at it through an MI lens and tell us what you see. And so the special issue that came out of it was a bit of an experiment, but generally speaking, we think looking back, it was very productive because it really allows you, by looking at these mediating actors, to move away, from a national bias, methodological nationalism, as Nina and Andreas Wimmer have, criticized many years ago already. This perspective always sneaks in again, but it also helps you to move away from an ethnic lens. And so, in that sense, most generally speaking, we thought already, wow, this is really a helpful concept. But then, in particular,
You need to point towards Jessica, of course, yeah.
Just in case.
I mean, the computer. Rather than the.
But in particular, when we looked at the 12 articles eventually that came out of the special issue, we tried to see what are the themes that emerge in the articles. We found that there were three, what we call them, vantage points that stood out for us, which I'm about to show you. I'll just go ahead. It'll catch up with you. So the first one we thought what was especially interesting in the special issue, that bringing an urban lens, great thinking, and an MI concept together really allowed the authors to look more at the political economic embeddedness of city making through migration. And for each vantage point, I'll give you one example from the special issue. So in this case, our colleague Matthias Bern from Ergner Research Institute in Berlin and his colleagues looked at how after 2015, when migration in Germany peaked, the business model emerged in especially East German cities where large, formerly public housing estates have been privatized. And so the owners started to rent out, particularly to refugees. Why? Refugees have a hard time finding housing in Germany. And when they're still in the process of applying, or they're just recently established, often the state pays for them. So it's a business model. So you could really see how this business model of renting out to this particular group emerges. And on the other hand, it shapes entire neighborhoods, because you suddenly have a large population of refugees living in particular places, not because they don't want to integrate, how the Germans like to say, but because that's where the housing is facilitated. Second point we thought was very interesting is the connectivity between different cross-border locations. And you may want to say, sure, migration industry is all about connectivity, and yes, that's true. But some of our authors showed that when you look at these MI industries through an urban lens, you actually see that the work of the MI kind of facilitates an actual physical and human infrastructure, quite literally connecting places. And a good example from this special issue is an article by Lonnie Waters. They look at the mobility of school children commuting every day, tens of thousands, from mainland China, Shenzhen, across the border to Hong Kong to go to school there, elementary and high school. And there is an entire industry, buses, tutors, nurses, daycare centers that facilitate that movement, and also basically creates a built infrastructure between these two cities. So thirdly, just for a second, an aspect that we haven't really touched on very much, I think, is the informal migration industry. We've talked a lot about established institutionalized actors, but in some of our articles, the authors also work on these much more informalized, less institutionalized actors that we would still count into the MI. And one of the examples is a wonderful piece from Zach and Landau from Johannesburg, South Africa. and they have been studying for actually quite a few years a neighborhood that has emerged around a bus station, park station neighborhood. And what's happening is there that fabric, textile, mostly from Asia and mostly China, is imported. And then small scale traders, sometimes individual, often women, from different regions in South Africa, but also other South African countries, come in, stay for a couple of days in the neighborhood, buy the fabric, need to store it, make contact with clients, need to stay overnight, leave again. And there's an entire neighborhood that caters to these needs. And it's very, let's say, at the margins of the city. It's not very institutionalized. So we've talked a lot about how we think migration industries shape cities, but of course that also works the other way around. We would say migration industries work differently in different places because they have to adapt to different institutional landscapes. And a project where we really came across this was the research project we did with Adana 2 years ago, where we looked at the role of nonprofits catering specifically to migrants, and we were wondering neighborhood organizations, so community-based NGOs, we would say, I guess. Our question was, were they able to continue the work under COVID? And we looked at 3 different cities, and obviously already kind of, assumed there would be different modes of working under COVID in these cities. But we were then actually quite surprised how different NGOs had to adapt, COVID or not, to the different institutional settings. Copenhagen, for example, had a surprisingly informal, very, personal, ad hoc, improvised relationship between NGOs catering to migrants that were not yet in the social welfare system. Berlin, as you can imagine, is heavily impacted by German bureaucracy. Nothing gets around bureaucracy in Germany. So, the NGOs are well funded. We heard that from Nina, public money, always that industry. And they connect highly regulated individual migrants to public resources. And Tel Aviv, we had a lot of migrant organized, self-organized NGOs that kind of gravitated around one particular city agency that works like an NGO, but it's a public entity. And it kind of coordinates this activity and also supplies resources. So in that sense, we were surprised how the same function, would be carried out very differently under different local conditions. Amir's gonna give us some takeaway points from this.
Right, so well, seeing that we're the only thing standing between you and lunch, I'll be very quick. So first of all, we realized that the structural, organizational, institutional dimension in the MI literature should be strengthened. I think we've seen quite promising attempts to do so in some of the papers that were presented earlier this morning. And we definitely think that a comparative approach is needed. Case studies, always good and interesting and insightful, but what we started to do, and I think others are attempting to do it as well, is to study how, well, first of all, how structure and agency in the context of particular cities are shaping migration industries. But the other, perhaps more important thing is to study how MI operate in different institutional settings. And employ different strategies. And Henrik kind of talked about the cases of the 3 cities that we've studied in the context of COVID. So the generation of profit, the provision of aid, relief, and so on and so forth. The urban political economy, as I think Aisha showed really nicely, of the MI is highly important. Different modes of profit making, historicizing different modes of profit making, kind of weaving or the interweaving between semi-public, public and private agencies, how MIs are regulated or not regulated, what are the power asymmetries and hierarchies between different actors in different urban contexts, these are obviously quite critical. And then what we kind of like to call the COVID effect, right? We perhaps keep talking about the migration industry as something that's fixed. And that's, there's a structure, there's a set of agents, and there you have it, the entire picture. But I think one of the things that we've discovered quite quickly in our Volkswagen project was that we need to pay much more attention to the temporal dimension and how the both individual agents and whole institutions and the city itself kind of changes obviously across space and place, but also across time. And it changes over time, and it has a different sort of modus operandi over time. So I think, this is just a kind of we hope, a beginning of a sort of a much more fruitful discussion about where we go with the nexus between MI and cities next. And we're very much hoping to hear some comments, critiques, and so on. Now, thank you.
Thank you. I'd also add that to this complex nexus of individuals and businesses, we should also add or even question the influence of technology on all of this.
Right,
How that itself is changing the migration industry as we go.
which was quite critical during
Right.
COVID, if you can imagine. Yeah.
Okay, so we have a strategy to deal with our questions. We'll take some questions from the audience here, and Umar will actually be following some of the questions that have come online from people who are participating online. And so our strategy is to take about 3 questions from the floor right now, and then they'll answer, and they'll be answered, and then Umar will go into 3 from online. Okay, all right. So I see a hand there, 2.
We'll take more.
Yeah,
take
okay,
more.
3, all right, go ahead.
So I'm wondering if there's anything in
If you
your,
can introduce yourselves.
Yeah, and loud, please.
my name is Afreen Chaudhary. I work for the Ministry of Citizenship and Multiculturalism. But I'm here for personal interest, not representing the government. So I was hoping to hear a little bit about equity. Like it's also part of the work that I do. So my question is really about, in your work, have you noticed an impact on equity and racism as a part of migration? And is there a gap in the services that are provided by the receiving countries? So Pauline, in your work for like the Filipino migrants, sure that there is this industry from the sending country and the receiving country that's set up to like help with the economic success. But what about the social success and the feelings of belonging? Like what's contributing to that? Sure, they feel like they belong. You said 90-something%. But what contributes to that? Is it because there's a community already established, or is it due to the ideal minority kind of view? And then when it comes to like Ethiopia, right? Sending back from Saudi, is there a lack of social inclusion when people get there? And like there must be some need for domestic labor in that sense, that people keep going to Ethiopia to, yes, escape like the domestic factors. But once you get there, like sure, you want to have a better quality of life, but what about inclusion? Like, do you feel like you belong? And then like when it comes to city making, is there things when it comes to feeling included in the city and participating economically?
So, sorry, I'm going to take all 3 questions, and then the panelists would respond. Again, 1 minute is my kind of mark. Short questions, short answers, please.
Hi, my name is Manuela Vodka. Thank you so much. This was an exciting panel. I have several questions that I'll reduce it to the two Ninas to start with. First of all, with respect to your work in kind of did you see any case in which the value extraction from volunteers would conflate with the work done by the refugees themselves? I just ask this because I know for about some of the situations happening in Berlin where the mode of management of refugee welcoming services was collapsing. And basically it was refugees who developed an app to help the Berlin management structure to deal with them. And this is basically free labor done by volunteers, but the volunteers were refugees. So did you see any of that in Halle? I'm wondering how generalized this is. And for Nina Neinbach, if I may, the question of hotspot semantics, I thought was very interesting. And I'm trying to grapple with the difference that it makes to whether or not we can note this positively, because we're talking here about a migration industry in which the semantics would depend on whether or not it's desirable or undesirable customers that are using a hotspot. So with the positive connotation of hotspot, it's the desirable customers that are accessing free Wi-Fi. It's not somebody's paying for it, but it's called free Wi-Fi. And with the undesirable ones, it's like the dangerous and the violent and the other hotspot, but it's the other type of migrant.
I have, my name is Sedef Arat Koç, and I have two questions. One is about the very notion of migration industries. I think Ayşe Çağlar has done a great job in identifying some of the continuities as well as ruptures and changes in migration industries. But I would love to hear from other presenters also about where do you see what is new about migration industries? Is it completely new, or is it something that has been changing over time, evolving over time, and so on? And the second question is about the political subjects and the political subjectivities that are being produced by the migration industry. I think William Barber has already given something the disciplining of the migrants and so on. But I think she was talking mostly about how the state, the Philippine state, as well as the Canadian state are disciplining the migrant subjects. What can we also think? I mean, I'm opening it up to other presenters here. What can we think about the question of political subjectivity or subjectivities being produced by migration industries?
Thank you. So to the panelists, please limit your answers to very short answers so that more people can participate. So who wants to answer the question on inclusion? On what? Inclusion, the question that was asked about inclusion. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, I've thought about it a lot as I watched both the service providers in these projects and the migrants. And it seemed to me that they were both facing a situation of ever-growing inequality and precarity. And while we think of the extreme precarity of migrants, it's useful to see that the workers themselves are people who are facing extreme, and that precarity too, in terms of always temporary jobs. Having university education and getting nowhere, which may sound familiar to more and more of us, right? And so while the projects, some of the projects are specifically aimed at anti-racism or equity, they never can really do anything about it because not only are they temporary, not only are the workers and the migrants all, facing the inequality in a political situation in which they have less and less say, and that's why I should have been pointing to authoritarian kinds of control that get rest, that they can't control the projects, they can't control the activities. And they're in a situation in which these corporations look for more and more ways of making profits of each aspect of their life. So, so the rhetoric about equity in the middle of this growing inequality it should startle us, actually. It should startle us because there's such a gap between the narrative and the day-to-day lives of people. Now, doing this research in an Eastern German city, and one that's in a lot of debt because they tried to regenerate it. Even that picture I had of the backhoe, they were constructing a new department store 10 years ago. It's now closed, so the businesses come and go, and the situation of people in the city does not improve for anyone. So I think it's useful to not separate the situation of migrants from the rest of the population, because that's the political narrative. Us, them, outsiders, they're taking ours, while in fact, a large number of people are facing more and more precarious conditions and less democratic ones.
Yeah, I'm going to limit it to one person to add. Do you desperately want to add a point to that?
Desperately not.
I could. Just take them. Yeah, quick.
No,
Go ahead.
well, I mean, there's so many things to say about that. And there's a whole, like the Canadian government has invested a lot in Metropolis project, John and others, talking about this notion of belonging, getting immigrants to belong and so on. As I was preparing for this, I just flashed through, some different stuff, and I saw this thing that I still can't believe. I'm going to just throw it out there. The Maritime provinces in Canada have been known to be quite hostile to outsiders and to exhibit not just to people coming from other countries, but also other places in Canada. But somewhere in there, it said something about reporting less racism. And there's been a lot of effort put into this on the part of local communities, constituencies, and so on, because there's a new need for migrants to feed these jobs. So small communities are out there recruiting their healthcare people and so on. And there's a lot more of a positive vibe, right? But it could shift on a dime. That's constantly changing. But anyway, I just wanted to say there is racism, but it's moving.
Now he's committed to
Yeah,
speaking.
now you have.
I'll be desperate for your comment.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to add something, in talking about social inclusion, I'm sure same thing in other cities too. Berlin has quite a few NGOs where we would probably think they're part of the MI, but they actually come out of social movement traditions. Often they're migrant self-organized, or they come from activist groups, for example, context of protesting the whole catastrophe in the Mediterranean with, thousands of refugees drowning there. But they professionalize, and why shouldn't they? Why shouldn't they get paid for their work either? And so the question for me is, okay, they get money. They maybe have some money to, pay some of their volunteers. But I'd still feel uncomfortable throwing them in the same analytical pot. So to me, it's an open question. How do you deal with these different degrees of institutionalizations, motives, functions, do you lump them together as MI, or do you find a meaningful way to separate them?
Sorry, I have to stop because there are questions flowing here, so sorry about that. Hotspot, who wants to answer? Just you. Yeah.
Yeah, but I will do it by saying that, you cannot talk about inclusion without talking about exclusion,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So some people are excluded in the
Yeah.
countries they leave and become maybe also excluded in the countries to which they come. And the whole domestic labor scheme is about that you are not promised inclusion. You actually have to exclude because you're supposed to go back. So Manuela, you asked about the hotspot semantics, whether we should distinguish between desirable customers and undesirable customers. Well, to me, that's not really the question, because I think that question is grounded in the integration logic, seeing migration research as understanding only what goes on in the country to which people arrive. But my whole point is that we cannot talk about migration industries, migration at all inequalities without involving both the global south and the global north. And maybe that's what's new in migration industry research, I think, or where it needs to go to look at how from very different positions, different actors co-create something here that has an extractive nature, where it's not just a poor global south that are totally innocent and a very, very, no, it's much more complicated than that. And I think we should look much more into how industrialized way of working with all these integration, whatever businesses, come to legitimize heightened state border control. I mean, I think that's the whole process. So it's an analytical work more than, something concrete going on.
Thank you. So who wants to answer the migration industry question, continuities and discontinuities?
I should not. I should not.
Yeah.
I mean, but the whole paper was on that.
Yeah.
That is what is new. I think that, I think the Nina's and the Thomas book was very important to show from the old kind of migration industry, brokerage and that kind of constellation, what was new in terms of the way that the markets, how that the different categories of actors were in it. But I think I tried to show that there are what we all the time talk about, the profits, and that is how profit-oriented understanding and private capital-oriented understanding of migration industries. It is important, but I think we have to connect it to the current dynamics of restructuring of capital. That's why I don't think that I completely agree with Nir and Henry. This is very much in terms of, and we did this long ago, and we were also in the neoliberal urbanism kind of the frame. And we were looking at the rescaling of the state in terms of the decentralization and detachment. And I think now it is, and many papers, I think it came out, how the states are very much involved in a different form. And I think this has to be connected to what is happening of the re-centralization, how the state food and the state power is reorganizing itself. And it is connected to the discussion of globalization, deglobalization, or the transfiguration, the reconfiguration of global order. And this is where I see it different. And that's why I asked, I was calling for decentralization of privatization and then the corporate capital. They are there, but this is not the whole story. And if we continue on that, I think we miss what is happening there.
Okay, thank you. So Umar will now have 3 questions from.
Thank you for that.
We left out the political subject.
Sorry?
Yeah, we did.
We left out the question of.
You talked about it.
We'll go back.
All right, perfect. So we have some questions for the attendees online. The first questions will be for Nina Glick Schiller. This is by Soma Shortiji from York University here in Toronto. She's curious of where in the immigration and infrastructure industry would you place the academic research complex on migration and immigration? She understands that most of this research is done in public universities, but she's referring specifically to these research institutes that are part of this state policy research nexus. That would be the first question. And the second question for you is by Emily DeRoche from the University of West England in Bristol. Basically, she would like to ask you that in the United Kingdom, there is a lot of emphasis for NGOs working with asylum seekers and refugees to hire people with experiences as migrants, because their life experiences seem to be indicative of better preparedness to dealing with migrants and refugees. In light of your presentations, however, it seems that to her, this could be viewed quite differently. And how would you interpret this from your analytical perspective? Yeah. And then there is some other question for the other Nina by Felicitas Hillman. What would what do you think should be done to avoid the state contribution to new vulnerabilities? Rach Woodville asked you in the same line, what would you think of the state intervention, in the Philippines, for instance, that promotes actively, the migration?
You didn't get the question.
Oh, sorry. One of the questions by Felicitas Hillman would be, what would you recommend when it comes to the diminishing or to avoid the state contribution to new vulnerabilities? And the second question would be by Rach Woodville, like your thoughts on the Philippine government's overseas employment programs to the citizens from your perspective.
Should I start? Well, to answer the first question that you were asking, in terms of the academic industry, academic migration research enterprise, I think that's an interesting question. When I first started thinking about it, I was just I would say, well, we researchers are all part of the migration industry. And then I started to, think about the difference between when you're making a profit and you're not making a profit. So certainly when academics are subcontracted and work as consultants, then we're definitely part of an industry, that there's no doubt about it. And so many of the people I've interviewed, that's why they were so disturbed, because that's the political subject. They wanted to be part of social movements. They wanted social justice, and they found themselves constantly searching for grants to make money for these larger corporate structures. But what about the people working in state, in the state, for the state government, for public universities? I mean, I think Aisha is really pointing us to something I think we collectively have to decide, which is sort of, what time is it? Where are we in the world? What kind of state do we have here? And there's a basic transformation going on, and we're groping for language. It is more authoritarian. It's not corporate capitalism, but there's such an entwining of large scale finance capital and state projects that, and political instruments of control and the media and technology and AI, that we're entering this world that we really have to be able to theorize and decide what we want to do about. Because, you know, the planet's at risk, and this is the political situation we're facing. Often our research tells what's going on. You know, we're always talking about the last stage because we had to analyze the data. We only have the statistics and things change. We can't afford that. We really have to be forward-looking and look at these transformations of power and the authoritarianism that's going on. So that's the first question. Was there a second question?
I think there was also a second question for the other. First, Nina, there was a second question for you about people with life experiences and NGOs.
Yeah, thank you. The migrants in the NGO.
Yeah, like in the United Kingdom, there is a lot of push for NGOs working.
May I suggest we don't need to answer each and
Yeah.
every small detail?
Yeah.
We talked about.
I
So I
think
think you already answered.
Yeah. Okay.
So should we go to your?
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, thank you, Felicitas. You should ideally have been here wherever you are, because you have been part of this migration industry discussion for a long time. I don't know if I'm the right person to answer your question, but what I would say is that whether states or state sponsors, entities like the IOM, sort of do the preparation of migrants before going or support them while abroad, I think it is limited. If we are saying what would the alternative be to the state of protecting migrant vulnerabilities, and if I should think what would be a better solution, I see a lot of well-organized migrant workers, not necessarily in traditional unions, because many of those unions are illegalized, but maybe in close-knit communities that could actually provide the information needed about the real risks involved. Also, the risks of being controlled by states, which state entities cannot provide. But since the question was relating to the Philippine case, actually, I think Pauline would be a better person to ask.
Just very quickly, following on from what you say, I think there are there are good networks. The information does exchange hands, and there are migrant support groups helping migrants all around the world, and it's because of that push that the state got more involved anyway. So, I don't know, but she knows that.
She does.
Yes.
Oh, that can take a lot of sense.
Now, just to also add to the question of universities and are we part of the migration industries? I mean, in many countries, there are public universities that are funded by public money, and they generate a large part of their budget by selling education to international students, and they have the whole infrastructure in place to bring students from abroad, because they also pay more money, so that you don't have to limit it to migration researchers. It's public entities that operate under corporate logics and use international migration to generate money.
Okay, we're going to do one more round, and then again, as it was suggested, we don't want to stay during lunch and this, but then there is a great deal of interest in asking questions, and then hearing the panelists. So first goes to Anna, and who else? And to see, one, and at very back, please,
Well, thank you. Well, thank you for exciting papers, and particularly, I think it was very timely to put the origin countries in the picture. And I think in your case, you're talking about sending countries. I'm generally allergic to sending countries, but I think it is good also to say when a country is a country of origin or a country that is sending people. But my question, I think, falls at the heels of Sadef's question. So I was trying to think, so how are things different from the past, and how do and I think to some extent, Aisha and you know, and all the speakers addressed that, but I'm trying to reconstruct the idea. So how does this relate to broader process of socioeconomic and political transformation in late capitalism? Should we call it global, racial, financial, platform capitalism? We can put many things in front of the capitalism. And and is it the fault of global capitalism or is it the fault of the nation state? And what comes first, ontologically or epistemologically? Because I'm thinking, so I was trying to reconstruct the argument and say, so the nation state deregularizes migrants, but also domesticates migration. So there are some people who are kept out. This is the control. Some people who are brought in. This is, you know, kind of labor or family migration or even resettled refugees. And those who manage to defy the regime. And these are, in my view, asylum seekers or irregular migrants of various sorts. And then they have to be domesticated. And I think our work today is about those people. What do states and other actors do about those people? And I think what I heard you saying is then, and the question is, how is this different from the past? And I know I say, like, actually, it's amazing how you trace how this location in Leeds is like almost the history of this. But it is not the case everywhere. So what are the actors that I see? And I get it. So one is the knowledge production industry, although also I want to say for all of us, there's no one that can stand outside the earth and look at the earth. There's no one that can stand outside the system and say, I'm free of all these constraints. I'm a neutral, you know, actor. Like we are all part of it, whether private or public universities, for-fee consultancies or volunteer consultancies, what have you. Then we have international organizations, international NGOs, local NGOs, and profit-making companies. And then we have cities. These were the actors that I wrote down. But I think what you're all saying is the role of the state is changing. And so what I understand and try to connect with how capitalism is changing is that the state is now becoming more extractive. That's a question mark, because I think exactly, I mean, if we look at the past also, Filipino migration or Ethiopian migration 20 years ago, or Halle and Linz 20 years ago. And it's managing its, so to speak, monopoly of power through market alliances. So is this, so my question is this, that is different? And in a way, why is it different? And then I think a little bit in this morning, we kind of bracketed out the role and agency of migrants, because they're not just recipients of this whole system, whether they're employed by the NGOs or whether they simply navigate those, you know, structures that are created to domesticate them, and actually often both are resilient, but also are resistant to those. Oh, thank you. Sorry that I was wrong.
Yeah.
Hi, so my name's Mir Costello. I'm a graduate, PhD student at York at CRS.
Could you please speak louder?
Oh, yes, I will. Is that better? So I study I'm at the CRS and for these studies here at York University. I have two provocations more than questions. So we spoke about four logics, Nina, obviously. You spoke about four logics. I wonder whether, but I have a feeling that we sort of elided a fifth logic, which is the short term. This idea of the short term, right? And that was something that came back and forth between
This logic is what?
the short term. So the temporalization, and I think temporalization is a crucial aspect of capitalism and in particular industry. And temporalization means I could translate that to fragments. I would say fragments, spaces, and places through time. And so in a sense, so is this not a fifth logic in a sense if we're thinking about migration as industry? And is this not then a logic of capital? Because it speaks to the extraction and the ability to intensify extraction obviously over brief amounts of time. The second provocation is, and it links to this one, is this idea of borders that I think is crucial if we think in terms of the future. So provocation by me. I think there's a lot of ideas that are emerging from that vast body of knowledge that is border theory. And I think perhaps in critical border theory, there might be some, or in thinking with critical border theory, this large body of literature that is known as critical border theory, and that is expanding
Critical policy theory.
critical border theory.
Border studies,
Border
critical
Water
border
studies, got it.
So that might be, in thinking about, so fragmentation, borders, I think there is a language there. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay, the question from the back?
Thank you. My name is Hari Kesi. I'm a research fellow at CERC. And my question is to,
Louder, please.
my question is to Nina Glick, to you.
His
To you,
question is
You.
addressing.
I'm sorry,
Can you come up here?
Sorry, come closer.
And
I have very old words.
So as you explained, the concept of the arrival infrastructure in the humanitarian industry, it is problematic in many ways. For example, the commoditization of migrants, and the exploitation of volunteers or maybe less low-based workers. But when we look at the same infrastructure from a different lens, in the light of the migrants, in the light of the immediacies of the lived realities, the challenges and problems, they are providing at the same time much needed services. And some of these organizations might also be working for the rights and to amplify the voices of these migrant workers. So we can see some sort of paradox involved here. So I wonder if you could comment on this paradox. And also how to, what is the way out? I mean, it's a very complex situation. So any I would appreciate your comment. Thank you.
All right. Who wants to answer the first question? Was by Anna. Yeah, can we make it short, please? Answers?
okay, I mean, I think that's a great question. I mean, I think this is what we are all grappling with. But I think in terms of the 2 points, in terms of the global south, and then it is that the kind of descending countries and or whether it is only a Linz story in that case, in mine, I have to tell this that I had worked on similar kind of thing in relation to Turkey. When I presented, everyone said that, oh, this is a Turkish story. This is a Turkish story. You could not generalize, oh, we all know that this is neoliberal, authoritarian, and this kind of changing forms of governance and that. And I felt so frustrated. And I had some work, that is, I had been following at Linz, and then this is what came out. And I have also another city where I was able to follow similar lines in Germany. So I don't think that it is specific in that. And I was trying to pull out some theoretical connotations. And I think in all of them, I think we are seeing the relationship between capital, state, and city is being changed. It is being reconfigured. And I think we should take this into account. And this changes the market alliances. That no one is saying that market is not there. Let me just read one quote from the Interior Minister, the leader of the right-wing party, unfortunately, who will win the elections in the fall. It says that we are thus taking a long-prepared step towards the nationalization of the entire asylum sector because we are convinced that no private business interest should be pursued in the asylum sector. We are launching a model that only knows winners. On the one hand, the asylum seekers who are actually entitled to protection, and on the other, the taxpayers. Of course, this comes together within the federal state established GmbH, which is a liability company, which are not tax-free. They are GmbHs have to pay. So it is a corporate too. So it is, I think we have to take it seriously, how this constellations have changed.
Yeah.
That would be my response.
So the next two questions are for Nina, which was a question on, what are critical border studies, fragmentation, all of that. And the second question was on, yeah. So, if you could make it fast.
I just want to link the question of short term. I think that's an important point to what Aisha was saying. And remind us that in the 1990s, I think, or 80s, Robin Cohn spoke about the rise of HELOCs. And he took a global view of what was happening on migration. And he said there's an emergence of unfree labor.
Yes.
This is the system we're going to see. And he was absolutely right. His book has just been reissued, I think, this year. And that has to do with the question of short term, because Michael Bass and I have just written about the end of migration as we know it, saying that the right of settlement now fits in with what the quote I just read, and the role of nation states in all this. The idea that you could migrate and bring your family and build a new future, that is being eliminated.
But Nina, that was only in North America.
No,
In
not
Europe, it was never a thing that you would settle. You should come and then leave when we don't want you anymore.
And if that was the ideology, but the actual reality was that people came and settled, whether it was a Turkish guest workers. The reality was, whatever the narrative, what people were found ways of moving and settling all of, wherever they wanted to go.
The labor.
Yeah, and even if they were defined originally as labor, people came as we know and they settled. But now this is becoming more and more difficult, and their short-term contract labor and circular migration is celebrated for professionals, as we well know, as well as for unskilled labor. This is seen, and has something to do with the fear of the dominant groups in the nation state, that they're being replaced by people that look different from them, so projects of race are very much in there, whether it's in Asia or here in nation state, projects of fearing, or mobilizing populations against using ideologies of race and nation. So I wanted to answer the short-term question in that way. So I think emphasizing that logic is very important. Now let me see, what was the critical border studies? Well, there's many. I don't engage so much in critical border studies, but it's another way of speaking about this. There are different ways of speaking about this. There isn't one right way, as long, to me, as you get to the question of power, capital accumulation, dispossession, and change. We are in, our migration theories have really not, until recently, addressed sufficiently the question of temporality, of the way the world changes, different historical conjunctures, and in a classic Marxist phrase. So let's see, what else was there? Was there a way out? Is there a way out? And what does these accommodation structures look like from the ideas, from the point of view of the migrants? I mean, in the point of view of the migrants, and I've been doing this work for a long time, you deal with whatever's there and you make it work for you as best you can. But projects that constantly get restructured, this churn, that part of the short term, really makes it extremely frustrating for everyone involved, except the people who are profiting from the churn. It's not the way to build, actually, frankly, institutes like CERC or anything else, to just constantly give a lot of money and then take it away, and give it to it and take it away. Since we see this widespread strategy, we have to step back and ask whose interests it serves. Okay. But of course, some people manage to make the system work for them. I mean, but that's why I'm talking about HELOCs, those opportunities, those ways of slipping through the gate. My friends who used to walk, Asian friends who walked, got to Canada and walked into North America. You can't do that very much anymore. So, and is there a way out? Well, that's a collective political question for us all. That is, when you think about it, that is a collective, and that's what's on the agenda.
Yeah.
Just one little thing, because I think the question about the humanitarians and the important work they do is really relevant, and I feel responsible for having written a book where we put them into the industry. It is very important to underscore that we are not talking about the quality of their work. We are talking about an analytical mode of understanding the radius within which they can move and get funded. I think that's really, really important. So it's not a critique of very important humanitarian work being done and how important it is to migrants and refugees. It's saying that the way they can work in this new structure is different from before. Yeah.
It's an upfront.
Yeah, so that's, I think, very, very important.
Thank you. So the final question is for Nick, coming online and.
Glick Director from the Metropolitan University here. It's a quick question for Nina Glick Schiller. How are the logics of migrant industry, applied to migration, the migration industry, different from other forms, in which neoliberal capitalism engages with other non-profit industrial sectors? Is there any differences?
That's very interesting. As I was writing them, I was thinking, well, this is, these are the logics of capitalism, and these are the logics of a transforming capitalism, that we just beginning to understand. It's the way it's changing. But it's useful to apply it to the migration industry. I mean, to follow up on the humanitarian part, because not to put down the work, but to say that even when people are trying, even in the sector where people are really trying to do good, where, and they are, they get caught up on this. That's why the plaintiff's cries of the people who were saying to me, but we're in the migration business. I mean, this is dramatic. I had a friend who started one of these NGOs and got all this kind of funding. And for years, he was telling me, I'm building this project and that project, and then he literally got paralyzed. He could not walk. And it was because he began to realize he was in the migration industry and all his efforts. I mean, it was like, it was a Freudian kind of, he couldn't move. And all his efforts, all this time had led to that. This is about the subject. The subjects. This is about the subjects and what it does to all of us when.
Finally.
Okay, I have just a very quick question. Aisha, thank you so much for your long read explanation. This is great. I was just wondering about this, modus operandi that you were trying to explain on how this works. Historically, migration, has been a business. Migration and, agriculture were synonymous. People thought about migrants. They thought 19th century, they thought about agricultural workers, farmers. And then the states at that time, they would say, okay, we were really inclusive to some migrants, but farmers, but not to other type of agricultural workers, such as Chinese or Black people from Africa, like the Nepalese, and so on and so forth, that were always excluded. I was just wondering, in your analysis of this modus operandi, from your long-term approach, how do you square the reaction of the participation of the state when the refugees happen to be white Europeans, as in the case of Ukrainians, with the difference of how they are treated in this modus operandi, when it comes, with people from the global south that are not white, brown, blue eyes, what I mean. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you very much. I mean, I think I would not put it as that kind of white, non-white, but I will go back to the question in terms of racial hierarchy or racialized hierarchies. And this is how I would look at it as racial capitalism. And in the case where I am talking about, it is very difficult to, I mean, all of them were variated, and there was a very fixed hierarchy in terms of whether you were displaced from an ally country or enemy country in those camps, whether you were Jewish or you were not, or you were locals, and that is it. And then the guest workers and the commuters were also from the vicinity. So it was not only the guest worker system. So you have a broad spectrum in terms of varieties of your conditions of labor and mobility. And this was very much racial. Coming back to the Ukrainians, that we, of course, there were some kind of advantages, privileges provided by the temporary protection system. But this temporary protection system is a kind of a deceiving folio, because the nation states were allowed to make their adjustments in it. So how Austria dealt and how Germany dealt and how Sweden dealt were very different. And in that sense too, again, this is not very clear kind of distinction in terms of how they were included into it. So I would not put it in terms of this is white and non-white, but assume that this kind of extraction, that the frame I'm working operates with these kind of differentiated, racialized, hierarchized differences. That is why racial capitalism is always part.
Final comment.
Yeah, it's actually going back to the question about what's different that you asked before. I think, you know, there's obviously the assemblage or the apparatus is very different today, as people already mentioned. I think two things that kind of come to my mind, and bearing in mind, I think what Anna said about the allergies she gets when we're talking about, you know, sending countries. And I think today we have three different types today. I mean, in the last few years, three different types of countries. We have countries of origin, countries of destination, and countries of, you know, transits. And I think in quite a few migration streams over the last 10 or 15 years, migrants are, you know, asylum seekers, migrants are staying longer periods of time in the transit countries. You know, we've done some interviews, for example, with Sudanese and Eritrean citizens who were en route from their countries of origin to Israel, but stopped for a lengthy period of time in Egypt and remained in Cairo. And some of the stories, some of the narratives is about how, you know, agents of the MI are either approaching them or they're approaching, you know, the agent. So there's a really interesting, I think, and quite different in many respects, MI that emerges in transit countries as opposed to, for example, destination or origin. And the other thing I'd say very quickly is that given the increasingly important or salient role of urban administrations, and the fact that sometimes their cycles are their political cycles are very different, perhaps even shorter than national administrations, I think it has a major bearing on how the, you know, urban specific MIs are functioning under different urban administrations. Sometimes it could be something as simple as, you know, the extent to which the incumbent mayor is liberal, and whether or not he or she wants to support, for example, certain you know, NGOs who are assisting migrants. And so I think the urban scale brings a lot more complexity into the question of what types and forms and structures the MI, you know, what kind of shape it takes in particular cities. So just
Thank
very
you.
quickly.
So if we all collectively agree that we don't want lunch and we could continue discussion, that would be fine. But anyway, I want to thank all the panelists for your papers, your discussions, and this was extremely interesting.